Hello and welcome to this webinar about the role of purpose in driving change in education systems. My name is Yue-Yi. I'm the research manager at the RISE program, and I'll be chairing the webinar today. And this webinar is running alongside our messaging campaign. Next slide, please. Which is a campaign running from the 24th of October until the 9th of December, where RISE and a wide range of partner organizations are leading a campaign that aims to bring attention to the global learning crisis and the need to use systems thinking to overcome this crisis and improve learning outcomes for children around the world. So in this messaging campaign, we propose 5 actions to accelerate progress in learning, which you can see on the slide. These bring together RISE research into key policy messages and recommended actions for stakeholders. And now this webinar is related to that first message that you can see on the screen about the importance of a system-wide commitment to universal early foundational learning. Can we have the slides taken down, please? So moving from the campaign to this webinar today, a lot of RISE research has been pointing to the centrality of a deep and fundamental commitment to achieving foundational learning for all children, and the importance of that commitment being present to achieve system-wide transformation in education systems. And all 4 of the papers today are talking about that very centrality of purpose, of mission, of commitment from different angles. And these papers draw on evidence from across different countries, different time periods, and different levels of the system. And we have 4 wonderful speakers to bring that to you today. First, we have Luis Crouch, Senior Economist at RTI's International Development Group, and he will be presenting research from his forthcoming study with co-author W. Spindelman on Korea and Japan. Second, we have Jonathan London, who's an Associate Professor of Global Political Economy in Asia at the Leiden Institute of Area Studies, and Jonathan will present research on Vietnam. Third, we have Dan Honig, Associate Professor of Public Policy at University College London, and Dan will speak about his work on motivation and management in the public sector. And finally, we have Michelle Kaffenberger, Deputy Director of Research for RISE, and Michelle will be presenting on a paper about the role of purpose in overcoming the learning crisis. A couple of quick logistical notes before we go to the presenters. So first, please use the chat to exchange ideas and comments and thoughts with other attendees. But if you have questions that you'd like the panelists to address in the Q&A later, please put those in the Q&A function because we won't see them in the chat. You should be able to access all of this using the bar at the bottom of your screen, possibly hidden under the more with 3 dots need be. And feel free to ask questions throughout the webinar, and we'll pick them up after all 4 presentations have been completed. And now over for the first presentation, Luis, it's all yours.
Thank you, Yue-Yi. And let me share PowerPoint. Okay, if I can move this. First of all, this is part of the series or area of work within RISE that has emerged recently around the role of purpose and maybe high purpose or important purpose in driving and motivating educational system change. Educational system change is really hard work, and part of the argument is that it helps to have a high or deep motivation. This is very much a work in progress, more so than the other papers here. Welcome criticism, comments. You'll see that some slides are particularly a work in progress and are kind of unfinished. And that's on purpose to signal that it is a work in progress and that we want comments. Let's see. Okay, so a little bit of the motivation is sort of my own field work, meeting often with COICA and JICA, people around the table, and observing that the things that they wanted to get the countries that they were interested in as research themes or technical themes were the things that were interesting to Korea and to Japan in the 2000s. And yet I knew that Korea and Japan had a glorious history of transforming their education systems. And I kept asking them and asking myself, what is there to learn from your history? Not from what you're doing now, which is probably not very germane to Africa today, but from your history. And later on in more field work, I saw a similar mismatch between the donor agencies and the historical reality of the countries that developed their education system. So the idea was to sort of test the hypothesis in a qualitative way that Korea and Japan did very interesting things and specific things that are quite different from the standard donor playbook, maybe even contrary to the donor playbook in some ways, and that there's useful stuff to be learned. And some of it might be borrowable, but with extreme caution, because we all know the pitfalls of policy borrowing. But why? Why Japan and Korea? And specifically in those periods, roughly end of 19th century to mid 20th for Japan, Korea after the Second World War, because they were catch-up transformation successes. They were very fast. They, however, as opposed to what's going on in the developing world today, maintained quality of learning, and they were fanatical about equality. And you will see what that fanaticism meant. And those are things that are mostly not there. And it was intentional and purposive because some other countries developed as well, like Finland, the UK, the Netherlands, but they weren't as intentional as Korea and Japan. And they explicitly borrowed, they considered things, and they explicitly rejected some things from the West. So it's just very interesting to see how passionate they were about their exploration. Just to show the kind of periods when this took place, and the fact that what took place is about as quantitatively impressive as what is taking place today. So you see one of those triangles show on the bottom the length of time that it took. So for Japan, from roughly 1880 to 1950, if you will, Korea roughly 1910 to 1970 or so, and the developing countries from roughly 1970 till today. And you'll see from the height of the triangles that the achievement was about the same, and from the slope that the time rate of change was about the same. So if that's the case, what is there to borrow? Because it looks like the achievement is pretty much the same. Well, what I would argue is equality, just the emphasis on equality and the emphasis on quality and learning. So what's there to learn? And to give you some idea of that, look at something like the average TIM scores of Japan and Korea there on the first row, two developing countries, picked more or less at random, but certainly not the poorest and certainly not the ones with the worst results. And then Netherlands and the Finland as developed country comparisons. And you'll see that the average in Japan and Korea is way high, 2 standard deviations above the developing countries, and significantly above the Netherlands and the Finland, which are seen as superstars. But most interesting is their inequality, how low the inequality in Japan and Korea is. I created an index of inequality. I could talk about it later, or you can read the paper. But Japan and Korea have about half of the inequality of South Africa and Indonesia, and a little bit lower, or maybe about the same inequality as Korea, as the Netherlands and Finland. So they score really high and they're extremely equal. Page down. Okay. Now, the typical reaction one we get from a Western audience is, well, but aren't Korean and Japanese kids all stressed out and, rates of suicide and blah, blah, blah. And I looked for that and I couldn't find any evidence. If you actually go look at the data, the rates of suicide and anxiety and depression amongst Japanese kids and Korean kids, about the same as in a Western composite that I did of Canada, US, Finland, and New Zealand. So, kind of countries that are seen as having pretty good but relaxed education systems. Same other typical accusation that I think is just Western envy, frankly, not to put too fine a point in it. I think it's just envy from the West about Japanese and Korean kids just being kind of rote learning automata. But if that's the case, how is it that Japanese and Korean companies regularly score in the top 20 or top 50 of worldwide innovation lists published by relatively objective bodies? You don't do that by having an education system that produces only automata. And then there are fantastic achievements on equality. If you look at South Korea versus India, You look at the Lorenz curves of South Korea and how close they are to the diagonal line, which is the measure of equality, and India. And in particular, take a look at how in Korea, if you look, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but in Korea, if you look at the x-axis here, very few kids are at zero. A very small proportion of the population gets 0 years of education. Whereas in India, even fairly recent cohorts, 40% were getting no education. This is in 2000, so this is the most recent data I could find. But if you add learning on top, or the low levels of learning that go on in India, it's even worse. So it's just a really dramatic difference in terms of equality. You know, a little bit then moving, that's sort of justifying the why, but now talking about the purpose. And the purpose was, in the case of both Japan and Korea, was largely a response to external threats. And the perceived need to literally save the nation or reclaim the nation from external imperialist or colonialist threats. In Japan, it emerged from the 2 or 3 centuries of self-imposed isolation during the Tokugawa regime toward the Meiji restorations in 1868 in response to an American show of force, more than show of force, an attempt by the Americans to force Japan to open up to the West. And Japan saying, okay, maybe we will, but on our terms, not on your terms. And sort of that's where the impulse to educate comes in, among other things, to modernize the nation. And Korea, in reaction to independence following Japanese colonization during the 20th century, but actually even before, Korea had started to react to American imperialism in the same 19th century, that demanded that Korea open itself up. And again, same, in this case, delayed reaction because they were colonized by Japan, to open up, but only on their terms. Trying to page down, but I can't. Here we go. A little bit on context, and I won't go through the whole slide because we did a lot of work on this, trying to make sure that we weren't comparing apples with oranges. And they had about the same base. At the beginning of the period, the population had about 1 year of schooling, about the same GDP per capita. Japan and Korea were about as equally poor as Africa was in the 70s or 80s. But they spent a much smaller amount of money, Japan and Korea did, about half of what Africa is spending today, or developing countries are spending today. But they also had a lower youth burden, so they had it easy in that sense. They had a higher population density, and they had lower ethno-linguistic heterogeneity. So if you look at all these things and balance them out, you would say that their starting conditions in terms of how easy it was to develop education were about the same. So if that's about the same, then what's left? To me, the argument is purposefulness and just the drive with which they did it, and the quality of the borrowing of the policy ideas, which are not ideas imposed on them sort of by faceless bureaucracies from the West, but through a process of really, really serious engagement with what they were borrowing, and including rejection of many of the ideas that they were looking to borrow.
Luis, you have 4.5 minutes left.
Oh, okay. I was looking at the time and wait a minute, I've been screen sharing for, okay, fine. I'll take your word for it. Okay, I'm just gonna have to speed up through this. Oh, and I'll speed up and talk about a couple of things. In doing this historical research, one of the things that we noticed was the importance of actually going to the text, to the foundational text that motivated things. And you can see in the preamble to the Japanese code how powerfully written it is, how poetic, how rhetorically powerful, and noting that the purpose in this case did focus on the military. So you don't necessarily want to, if you want to borrow the notion that you have to high purpose, it doesn't need to be military. I mean, we all know what this military focus of the Japanese led to in terms of the invasion of China and the Second World War. but having a high purpose is important. And abusing of the time and just, I know that I just won't get through even a fraction of my slides, but that's okay. That it was not just to rescue the nation, but it was also explicitly a class warfare thing. So I'll actually read, not here, but read a couple of other lines. Learning, so referring to its own past, the Japanese said, learning was viewed in the past as the exclusive privilege of the samurai and his superiors, and others were neglected altogether. Farmers, women, artisans, merchants were neglected. Even among the few samurai and his superiors who did pursue learning, were apt to claim it to be only for the state, and they indulged only in poetry, empty reasoning, and idle discussions and dissertations, while not lacking in elegance, were completely inapplicable to real life. So, imagine a modern bureaucracy talking in those terms. And they had an impact. I mean, you can see immediately after the Meiji reforms start, the class basis of composition at Tokyo University started shifting toward the commoners, and of course kept on going. This is just a 10-year period. I'm going to have to skip a whole bunch of this stuff. Talk about a little bit about policy borrowing. It was very directed by the country itself. They sent out missions instead of receiving missions, and they interacted in a very deep way through all kinds of ideological debates. Then, as to the means that were implemented, that were used to implement the purpose was a very strong degree of technocratic governance. This slide is not quite finished, and we have to find a bit more evidence on it. Very measurement focused, and what I would claim non-ideological approaches, taking things from the West, rejecting some, borrowing some, and they were ideological. They were, as far as I can tell, non-ideological as to means, whereas very ideological as to purpose. And I'm saying one doesn't need to borrow the ideology. One needs to borrow the fact that the purpose has to be and can be very high. And as to means, foundational learning first, the foundations and equality. For example, in both these countries, the best teacher in the school is in grade 1. Now, find me a country in the developing world today where that's true. None, or typically none.
1 minute left, sorry.
I'll finish up. 15 minutes is a very short time. So lessons from the current policy environment is that looking at purpose and trying to regain purpose in all this. I mean, compare the purpose in Japan to, making the gender index 1 or having 100% completion as opposed to saving the nation. It just makes it easier to identify what it is necessary that you have to do. What are the things that are nice to have? What are the things you must do? And it shapes your strategy for when you borrow, when you engage in policy borrowing from the World Bank or from UNESCO or from other countries. It shapes how you select your strategies, and it also helps guide your measurement strategy. And yeah, okay, I'll quit.
Do you want to give us one final sentence?
That we're still working on understanding what might be borrowable and what is less likely to be borrowable in terms of what they actually did, the means for their purpose. But of course, what needs to be borrowed is the regaining of a high purpose, of a centrality to education that it just doesn't have, even in the SDGs.
Great. Thank you very much, Luis. And I will look forward to hearing more of your paper in the Q&A section. But first, we're going to go to Jonathan London next, and he's going to move to another country in Asia, so Vietnam. All yours, Jonathan.
Hi there. Thanks very much. And what I'm going to be doing is presenting some research that I've been conducting with Dung Bạch Hang, who's now at the University of Arizona, on the politics of education in Vietnam. And I just realized actually that I do need to share my other screen, so I'm going to do that very momentarily. Apologies for that. And and I'll go back to. Okay, can you see the presentation?
Yes, we can.
Okay, sorry. Vietnam is a contemporary outlier, having achieved high levels of learning outcomes at relatively low levels of income, and has drawn worldwide attention for this. And I'm going to share with you some of the results of our research that has explored the politics of education and learning in Vietnam to try to account for some of these learning outcomes. And when we look at, Vietnam, we can ask these sorts of questions about its history, including its cultural ties to Confucianism. It's also anti-colonial history, which was very much instrumental in the Communist Party of Vietnam's drive to educate its population. Of course, in the last 30 or 40 years, Vietnam has been through enormous changes, going from being one of the poorest countries in Asia to one of its fastest growing, and it's projected that Vietnam's economy will continue to grow at a reasonably rapid pace up until 2050. So what we've done in this research is a sort of deep dive into the politics of education in Vietnam, including a comprehensive analysis and historical investigation of the context of Vietnam's education system, and also more than 100 interviews conducted in Vietnam. So what I'm going to do is underscore some of the key drivers of Vietnam's achievement with respect to education and learning. And the first thing I want to talk a little bit about is the Communist Party of Vietnam's political commitment to education. Of course, education has a multifunctional role in any context, and it's used for various purposes, including socialization, knowledge transfer, and the promotion of learning. But in Vietnam, these socialization aspects are especially pronounced, which is reflected in the red scarves that all students don as they go to school every day, and also the Communist Party of Vietnam's drive to really use the education system as a way of monitoring society in general, as indicated by the 24 million individual student records that the country currently has on all students attending school within the education system. It's also reflected in the public finance that the Communist Party of Vietnam puts forward with respect to the education system, which includes about 20% of the annual budget. Where it all goes is less clear. But importantly, the substantial redistribution that the Communist Party has pursued over the last 20 to 30 years ensures that indeed education is, in comparison to other countries, well-financed across various regions of the country. Vietnam also reflects an openness to policy borrowing, and there's some interesting discussions to be had about which policies Vietnam has borrowed from overseas and how they've turned out. But it should be emphasized that the country is moving in the direction of the adoption of new pedagogies and curricula, as is reflected in its experimentation with the Escuela Nueva model, and more recently, the rollout of a new curricula, which really does mark a very significant turning point in the country's policies. So one of the key features of Vietnam's political system is the presence of party politics as a perpetual discipline upon the public governance of all aspects of social life, but certainly within the education system. And what we observe is that within the education system, party politics ensures continuous procedural attention to education, a great emphasis on professionalism within the ranks of the education sector on down to teachers. And also that nonetheless, we have a country that, despite these centralized political features, administratively, fiscally, is quite decentralized. And I'll come back to this because this presents certain challenges. Despite this decentralization, however, the Communist Party of Vietnam is continuously at work emphasizing education, and not only that, but ensuring sort of levels of professionalism that we do not observe in many other countries with comparable levels of income. I wouldn't say that this is a laser focus on learning as perhaps we saw in Japan and Korea during their earlier periods of industrialization. Nonetheless, it is quite striking. Another interesting and perhaps to those less familiar with Vietnam, somewhat surprising aspect is the high levels of societal engagement that we find in Vietnam in the education system. And this takes a variety of different forms, one of which is reflected in this photo of parents standing outside something called the Bill Gates School, which is actually a publicly funded program attached to a public school. And what they're protesting is a school decision that requires them to have their students attend extra study sessions, and they have fighting back against this. But the reason that this is important is that in our research, not only do we have this perception and reality of increased returns, public and private returns to education, but we also see that the Communist Party over the last 20, 30 years, in addition to its robust financial support for education, has consciously made efforts to channel economic financial resources into the education from, quote, society, unquote, through a variety of policy measures, including charging various kinds of fees and other measures. And, not all of this is beautiful or wonderful. Not all of it works well. There's some corruption involved, but at the end of the day, what we have is a lot of participation from households in their children's education. And we contend that this represents a sort of societal buy-in in the literal sense. Furthermore, in Vietnam, you might be surprised to know that there's an extremely active, what I will call educational public sphere that we observe online through a variety of online publications. And this is indeed something that we note as significant. One of the things that occurs, for example, on a regular basis is equivalent to a sort of whistleblower function in which public appeals online get filtered into various policy debates. So beyond our analysis of the education system at the national level, our team conducted research in 3 different localities, including Haiphong in the Northeast, Nan in the North Central, and Kienzang in the Southwest. And what we essentially were interested in doing is exploring this concept of education system coherence for learning. That is a situation in which there are multiple different kinds of accountability relations ongoing within the education system that promote and enhance attention to various policy objectives, including learning. And so what we observe is that in Vietnam, there are these important forces for system coherence, including, as I mentioned, political commitment and societal buy-in, and aided by economic growth, as well as the strengths of Vietnam's education policy, which is fairly well elaborated. On the other hand, in Vietnam, we have a system of governance that is really not only decentralized, there's nothing intrinsically good or bad about that, but it's fragmented. And we observe these accountability gaps between national policy goals and what's happening at the grassroots. And specifically, what we see is a weak alignment among delegation, finance, and information and school support. And so again, you have this sort of formal procedural compliance with policy, but not a lot of intensive collaboration between various stakeholders within the education system. And this suggests that there's room for improving Vietnam's performance with respect to learning. And this can be achieved by addressing various national and subnational accountability gaps. And so, one of the things that
you have a bit more than 5 minutes left.
Okay. One of the things that we've done in the course of our research is explore, possible steps to promote increased coherence for learning. And this would include clear delegation of tasks and making sure that there's an alignment of what's happening, for example, in finance with information and how well that supports learning goals. I'll give you a concrete illustration. In a very small minority of provinces, do we find a close collaboration between provincial departments of finance and departments of education. We do not find a situation which has been paraphrased elsewhere as, okay, here are the tasks you need to perform, here are the resources, and this is how the central government is going to evaluate. So there's a lot of looseness and slack and gaps of accountability in the system. And it's also been suggested that it can be useful to make policy aims and education finance more transparent. And the feeling is within Vietnam, and indeed this is something that Vietnamese education researchers have pointed to, that having greater financial transparency as to how public finance and education is used can help inform further policy debates, because now this absence of transparency really makes it difficult for anybody, including researchers who normally don't have access to this sort of information, to make informed contributions. And so what we're finding in our own research is the use of combining multiple different sort of forms of research. And, coming from the fields of sociology and education research, we're very much into this sort of thickly descriptive and analytical brand of research that tries to understand what's happening at a granular level. So next steps in our research is about how we can continue this line of work, even though the RISE program is itself winding down. We see an important agenda of research that we very much want to continue with. And this would include, exploring and developing new thinking about how to support and motivate schools in Vietnam around learning. Identifying the kinds of capabilities and information that various stakeholders, including local researchers, policymakers, and civil society actors need. And indeed, we're very much looking forward to developing our partnerships with local researchers further. And then also a program and agenda of continued research and advocacy around this idea of coherence for learning. Again, this is something perhaps Michelle will talk a little bit about later, but how we can go about promoting accountability at a system level from multiple different directions around these learning objectives. And one idea in this context is to develop national observatories, certainly in Vietnam and perhaps elsewhere, through which we can build local capacity to promote this sort of systems analysis, to better understand what's happening in the education system, and also to work on our communication of research and advocacy so that we can actually bring this substantial body of knowledge to bear on public debates and public policy. So I'll stop there, but thank you very much, and I'll look forward to discussions later.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jonathan. And thank you for donating 90 seconds to vibrant public debate in the Q&A. Speaking of the Q&A, just a note to all attendees, if you have any questions that in particular can be addressed by multiple presenters as you start to listen across presentations, that'd be great, because the more debate discussion we can have across papers, the better. But in the meantime, we're going to go on to our third presentation from Dan, shifting gears a little bit from education specifically to public management more generally. Dan, the floor is yours.
Excellent. Thanks so much. Thanks for having me. Really an honor and a pleasure to be here. So I'm going to be talking today about this RISE essay on managing for motivation as a public performance improvement strategy. This draws heavily from a book manuscript I'm working on mission-driven bureaucrats, which goes well beyond education. I'll refer to in a few places today. And, in some ways, if Jonathan and Luis have talked about sort of systems level purpose, I see this as maybe the micro or the meso complement to that. That is to say, how do we think about sort of management at the bureaucratic level, maybe in a system less wholly devoted to purpose as the examples we've been given in the last couple of presentations? How do we move in that direction when we don't have an external force or a kind of national pushing in that direction? So how do we improve system performance? I would say I agree with Erin McDonnell when she writes in her wonderful work in Patchwork Leviathan that the currently dominant approaches to state reform seek to limit discretion. That in general, our approach, I would say, over the last few decades has been to use abstract monitoring systems that can monitor across large scales and at a distance, that assume that only a pinnacle principle can be trusted to monitor their interests, that are, in contrast to Jonathan's description of thick information, thick observation that might come from observatories at the country level, rather thin information, giving us kind of quantitative metrics and pulling performance and orienting towards sort of the top-down as a reform strategy. And I describe that in my work as top-down root X, which is depicted in red here at the bottom of your screen. So the idea of root X is that we have agents who would not otherwise do the things we would like them to do. And as a result, what we are going to do is we are going to orient their performance towards the things we would like them to do that they would not otherwise do, right? So we're going to use carrots and sticks, right? We're going to induce alignment of the agent's actions with the mission of the organization and thus with overall performance. In contrast, supportive root Y, bottom-up root Y management is depicted in green here. If we have agents who would otherwise like to act in ways consistent with the mission of the organization, then we need not guide them so explicitly, so extrinsically towards the activities, towards the actions we want to see them take, but instead support the motivation they already have. What do I mean by supporting the motivation? Well, as I described in the paper, I mean things that map onto psychology's self-determination theory. That is to say, things that allow autonomy, that give agents the space and encouragement to engage in consequential independent judgment and action, that cultivate competence, that support these bureaucrats in actually taking self-directed action, in learning and growing, and thus in fostering a self-actualizing perception of skill and agency, right? The sense that I can do things, that as I do more things, as I gain more skills, I can do more things, that I can see the product of my work. And that helps connect organizations, that helps connect bureaucrats to that purpose, that promote your purpose by connecting bureaucrats to results in some manner, creating a positive feedback loop. And to kind of riff off Jonathan's descriptions just a little bit ago, we can think of this as a thick account as compared to thin accountability styles, right? So this is using terminology Lant Pritchett and I developed in earlier work. So accounting-based accountability will get us that process compliance. It will get us numbers, it will get us targets, but largely accounting-based accountability is going to support a sort of root X reform attempt in most cases. By contrast, an account-based accountability scheme is going to allow a broader set of things to come in. It's going to allow us to realize that thicker information, and by rethinking what accountability is, we can build reform efforts more compatible with this sort of root Y way of doing things. Well, why would we want to do so? How is root Y going to get us towards better performance? I argue that management practice is going to change the motivation of employees, right? So we often talk as if people have a fixed motivational type, but I think anyone who's ever held a job is aware of the fact that one's motivation at the job has something to do with how one is managed. Management practice is also going to change who enters and exits a workplace. People are going to leave workplaces where they cannot realize their sense of purpose, their sense of mission, if they are indeed mission driven. Also, it's going to affect who enters the workplace, who applies to jobs, and then of course, who stays there. And in general, I argue that supportive management practice can and does often in fact work better, that it outperforms top-down management, particularly when monitorability is weaker and mission motivatability is higher. So in the book, I bring lots of evidence to bear in support of these ideas, of these hypotheses. Here in our conversation, I'm going to focus just on a few strands of those evidence and dive into them fairly quickly. So in Thailand, we see some of the world's steadiest welfare improving progress. We see, I've described these as some of the world's most boring development graphs in the sense that Thailand gets a bit better incrementally year on year in a way that's led to sort of transformative change over generations. This is particularly surprising when we think about the relatively rapid and often quite tumultuous change of governments that Thailand's seen over the same period. Doing field work in Thailand, in 8 Thai districts, interviewing over 150 people, mixed methods with surveys. I ascribe this sort of surprising consistency to the centrality of a different kind of purpose, a different kind of mission in Thai local governance. This is a picture of a sign in a district government office that appears in many district government offices that articulates the central mission of Thai local governance, that alleviating adversity and nurturing well-being is our honorable mission, or Bambatuk Bomnung Suk. And you hear this articulated by bureaucrats, but also by citizens when they think about the sort of the performance of Thai governance. And what I find is that is essentially the power of weak tools and strong missions, that the heads of district who ostensibly supervise these bureaucrats, the Bangkok appointed bureaucrats who control much of funding and activity in the districts, is that they lack top-down managerial tools. They have very little ability to sanction appointees who are in fact from other Bangkok-based ministries, and thus they must manage in a supportive way by encouraging and supporting and cajoling and building team morale. They do so differentially, but they're all very much on that side, the kind of root Y equilibrium side of the house. This forced supportive management is due to this kind of management without authority that they find themselves in. And this leads to highly intrinsically motivated bureaucrats who are highly satisfied and exercise a lot of judgment. If we compared these Thai bureaucrats to nationally representative samples from other countries on the global survey of public servants, these Thai bureaucrats who we survey would be second of 17 countries on this survey in intrinsic motivation, and number 1 all the way at the top at job satisfaction, despite being bureaucrats in a political system where change is rapid and has been over the course of all of their careers, including in recent years. This system also buffers delivery from political turmoil at the top. Delivery remains apace because of this sort of intrinsically motivated cadre of bureaucrats at the district level. In some ways, I argue the weakness of the Thai managerial state appears to be its developmental strength. So I just told you a story pretty consistent with the idea that management and motivation have something to do with each other, something to do with purpose, but does it generalize? So let's look at existing civil service surveys, combining all publicly available data. So 5 countries, over 4 million individuals, over 200 agencies, over 2,000 agency observations. And look at kind of equilibria of these basic, that speak to these basic causal mechanisms. Well, supportive management practice and intrinsic motivation do indeed co-vary even within agency. That is to say, when perceived managerial quality or root Y management practices go up in the inside an agency, so too does the intrinsic motivation of the employees in that same agency as compared with the prior year in that agency. We also see on the sort of exit and entry margin that the more intrinsically motivated people are, the more mission motivated they are, the greater the extent to which management of practice is associated with their intention to leave. So that is to say, if you want to keep the mission motivated, you have to manage in a way that lets them fulfill their mission or they'll exit. However, if you do manage that way, you will differentially keep the mission motivated. The mission motivated are more responsive to these changes in management practice over time in thinking about their own career intentions. So we also see that supportive management practice outperforms a sort of top-down hierarchical approach in what I'm going to call head-to-head competition. We see that in Pakistan, in a randomized controlled trial led by Yasir Khan, this, by the way, slide is entirely work of other wonderful scholars, or wonderful scholars who are not, wonderful scholars, but not my own. And none of these folks, I think, have sort of mission, motivation, and purpose in mind as they think about the work. But I think it all sort of contributes to the central argument. So we see that having sessions that help people think about their purpose leads to greater performance gains than do financial rewards, a pay for performance scheme for Pakistani health workers. We see in observational data looking across Nigeria that you get better performance with more autonomy and fewer incentives and control, even in Nigerian infrastructure work, which might not be the place where we were most likely to think ex ante that we would find mission and a high sense of purpose. Looking across Ghana, we find that more discretion autonomy is associated with better performance, especially for tasks that are ill-suited to predefined monitoring. And back in Pakistan, this randomized control trial from some very prominent economists finds that autonomy outperforms pay for performance even in procuring very simple, very monitorable goods like A4 paper and pencils and things that we might otherwise think are quite easy to monitor. So why is this? Why are we seeing—
you have just over 3 minutes left.
Sounds great. So why are we seeing so many performance gains to these sort of root Y approaches? Well, I think it's because we forced ourselves so far into a kind of X reform equilibria that we've ended up with way too much X and not enough Y in the system. I'm happy to talk more about that in Q&A. So basically, it's not that X can never lead to performance gains, but they don't do so here because of the sort of overuse that's already occurred. And it speaks to the large margin for Y in my view. So I think we can get better performance with less control. I think we need to consider the costs as well as the benefits of hierarchical management and think about supportive management as an input, not just a response to good performance. And that means recruiting and managing for mission, motivation, and purpose. So again, I think this is in some ways the micro of centering purpose and organizational change. There are things we can do. There are things that organizations and agencies can do. They can promote purpose directly in the way that Yasser Khan's wonderful work in Pakistan does. They can foster peer accountability. They can change what data means in their systems from being the answer to being an input into performance. And more broadly, they can empower and support. And there are many ways of allowing autonomy, cultivating competence, and promoting purpose. In the minute and 45 seconds, I think I've left, so you will correct me there. I just want to talk about some alternative purposes, because we've seen such grand purposes in Jonathan and Luis's description of high purpose. So I do interviews as part of the book. And this is the first director of the census in South Sudan, right? So somebody given the job of figuring out where things are, where people live, what the numbers mean in a place where there is very little ability to monitor because no one knows what a good answer, what the right answer looks like. And fortunately, Lavanya Margaret was in charge of this job. And she says, in part in our interview, even when God was creating, he must have used statistics. Numbers change people's lives. This is somebody who quite lovelily, for those of us who use data all the time, believes that data is transformative and sees that as her mission, as her purpose in the work. Batula Sadi, the first female revenue collector at the field level in the history of Balochistan, talks about her obligation to all females, that if I'm doing it right, I'll open a path to them. If I'm doing it wrong, that will be the end of it, and her desire to set an example. And Joseph Roberts, who this picture is taken by me actually on an evacuation flight as I evacuated from Senegal towards the beginning of the pandemic. So this is an American bureaucrat working for operations medicine. I took this picture about 30 seconds after a plane full of folks applauded him for his service and for his and his team's help. He speaks to the desire to help his fellow citizens in our interview, which I did obviously many months later. And he also speaks to the peril of management practice that doesn't allow people to promote purpose. He says, if I didn't feel like I was accomplishing anything here and I didn't feel like I was trusted, I probably wouldn't be long for this job. No one would. And I'm glad he was there. And I think we all are. This is not just an abstract question. Allowing bureaucrats to promote the purpose as they see it, to follow their missions, is critical to us, not just as scholars or thinkers, but also as citizens. Thank you for your time, and really look forward to the next presentation and the discussion to come. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dan. So for our last presentation, we're going to pivot back to education with a synthesis paper on the role of purpose from Michelle.
Great, thanks. Let me share my screen. Okay, I think it's up. Great. Okay, well, thank you so much. It is really great to be here and really exciting to be hearing about this work that we've heard about so far and this body of work that's coming out of the RISE program. And in keeping with the theme, I'm also obviously going to be talking about purpose-driven education systems, and I'm going to do it in the context of this new paper that's on the verge of coming out on the role of purpose in education system outcomes. And I'm going to be talking about a conceptual framework and tying that with some empirical examples. And so first I want to start with a puzzle, and that puzzle is the case of Vietnam, which we just heard a great presentation about Vietnam from Jonathan. And so as we heard from in Jonathan's presentation, Vietnam is a significant outlier when it comes to learning outcomes. We have a whole RISE team that Jonathan's a part of, dedicated to investigating how they've been able to achieve these outsized outcomes relative to their kind of level of economy and development. And so this is just one very small snapshot, but here we're comparing advantaged children in other middle income countries with children of similar demographic and socioeconomic characteristics as those in Vietnam. And what you can see is that Vietnamese students score on average about 200 PISA points more than similar children in other countries. And this is the equivalent of about 6 to 8 years worth of education at the age of 15. So we can see from many different data sources, this is just one, that Vietnamese students are far outperforming children of similar demographic and socioeconomic characteristics, even in countries that are wealthier than Vietnam is. But that's not the only example. We have others. And so Sobral, Brazil presents a second puzzle. And so Sobral is a municipality in Brazil. It is among the poorer municipalities in economics terms. And in Sobral in the early 2000s, the municipal government undertook a major education reform effort. And over the course of 12 years, Sobral rose from being the, as you can see there, being the 1,366th ranked municipality on Brazil's national assessment to being the top performer on that same assessment. And so what we see is that while most of Sobral's schools are in the second lowest SES category, they're now outperforming nearly all schools, including in higher SES status categories. And so what explains these types of learning achievements that we observe in contexts like those two, as well as others? So in these examples, higher income and resources and or greater knowledge of kind of the what to do to achieve learning outcomes cannot explain the differences that we observe in outcomes across these contexts. These examples and others that I point to in the paper leave us with this kind of much more complex set of questions of how and why success was achieved in these places. And so in this presentation, I am going to briefly propose a conceptual framework for understanding drivers of education system performance. And I'm going to use it to argue that this commitment to the purpose of learning that we've heard so much about in the earlier presentations is a critical missing link in how we think about addressing the learning crisis. I'm then going to apply that conceptual framework to examples that we have of successful system improvements, and then finally close out by describing some of the efforts that we observe in different contexts that have fostered a commitment to this purpose of learning. And so to develop the conceptual framework in the paper, we borrow from the organizational management literature, which holds that organizations have a technical core at their center that produces the value for that organization. And then that technical core is supported by a series of support functions that kind of surround and support that technical core. And so the technical core includes purpose, which is the set of strongly held beliefs about why that organization or system exists, what it's aiming and working to achieve. And then the technical practices that are necessary to achieve that purpose. So the technical skills and the know-how necessary for achieving that purpose. And then, like I said, those technical practices are then surrounded by support functions that create those operating conditions and the infrastructure for the technical core to achieve the outcomes. And so those support functions include things like HR, finance, IT, et cetera, that support the core to achieve what it's working to achieve. And so purpose can be explicit. It might be clearly stated and then acted on what's being stated. Or in other contexts, we see the true purpose is quite implicit. It might only be understood by those operating in the system, or it might be understood by a broader set, but it's not kind of clearly written down. And so this would be context maybe where, say, corruption is pervasive, and a context where the true purpose is actually rents to different individuals that are part of that system, but that wouldn't be the explicit purpose, obviously, that's being stated. And so what we hold in this work is that we propose that these three same characteristics that are fairly well established in, like I said, this kind of organizational management area also apply to systems, and in this case, apply to education systems. And we argue that all three affect education system outcomes. And so if we believe that all three affect outcomes, then we looked at what research is being conducted in the global education space, and also what kinds of interventions and implementation work is being done in the global education space. And what you see is that most interventions focus on either technical practices, things like teacher training or trying to improve the technical skills within a system, or support functions. So things like expanding an EMIS system, procuring more inputs for that system. But that purpose receives relatively little attention. And we argue that it's a potential critical missing link in addressing the learning crisis and improving learning outcomes. So we observe education system purpose taking many different forms. These are just a few of the examples of forms that we see it taking. And to be clear, I'm going to talk through a couple of different examples. These categories are not meant to be mutually exclusive, nor are they exhaustive. Obviously, systems would probably contain some characteristics of each form, but we feel that these are useful kind of illustrative forms to be thinking about the types of purposes that systems hold. And so one that we observe are contexts where a purpose of an education system is kind of a maintenance of elite-focused education. And so many countries have a history of education systems initially being established to educate the elite. And in a lot of these contexts, there may have been a large expansion of schooling for the masses, but actually quality education is still reserved only for the elite. And so an example of this would be the way that India has been referred to by many people, including some of our colleagues with RISE, as a sorting and selection system. And so while India has successfully gotten most children into school, they hold that its primary kind of core purpose, maybe somewhat implicit purpose, is still as a selection system. It's aiming to select the top performers for further quality education with very little regard to the learning outcomes of the rest of the students that are in the schools. Another form that we see education system purpose taking are contexts with contested purpose. So this would be contexts where the system maybe has too many purposes. Even if all of them are good or legitimate purposes, the system might just be pulled in too many different directions that it's not able to effectively achieve all of those purposes that it's trying to achieve. There may also be contradictory purposes, so purposes that are actually pulling in different directions, or outright disagreement or infighting about purpose from within the system. And then another form that we see it taking are contexts where perhaps the purpose has been corrupted. And so this would be contexts where purpose has been hijacked or supplanted by another, sometimes hidden purpose that's maybe not publicly acknowledged. This would be contexts where the purpose might include rents, say to officials or to contractors through procurement. It could also be contexts where maybe the purpose has become maintaining bureaucratic compliance, kind of completing paperwork and going through the motions and ticking boxes, but again, with little regard for kind of the educational experience that students are having in the classroom, as well as teachers and others individuals involved. And then finally, we see contexts that have been repurposed to encompass learning for all. And so these would be contexts like some of which we've heard from earlier today that have included an establishment of learning as a fundamental and kind of core purpose of the education system, followed by the actions that support this purpose. And so what we argue then is that this kind of commitment to this purpose of learning for all may be a necessary, even if it's not sufficient condition, but a necessary condition for achieving the kinds of large-scale learning improvements that we're hoping to see in education system transformation. So now I want to take that conceptual framework and apply it to a couple cases where we have seen system improvements for learning. So we have a short but growing list of education systems that have improved learning outcomes and have kind of achieved this level of large improvements across the system. And a common theme across them is this kind of establishment of learning as a core purpose that then led to other areas of reform. And so, as I mentioned up at the top of the presentation, Sobral is a case example of significant improvements over a relatively short period of time, over the course of about 12 years in the grand scheme of things. And what we observed when we examined the case of Sobral is that there was this kind of initial establishment and commitment to learning at the start of the reform process that then kind of facilitated and led to the other changes that we saw. So starting with kind of this establishment of purpose, in the early days, there was the municipality implemented an assessment that found that 40% of primary school students were not able to read. That was one data point among, of course, many others that kind of taken together led municipal leaders to establish learning as a core purpose, including by setting very clear and explicit goals for universal literacy in the first 2 years of primary school. And they also included elements of remediation for older students to make sure that older students didn't kind of fall through the cracks in a reform that was targeting primary school or the younger students. And then really importantly, in this case, and I think I saw a kind of a reference to this come up in the Q&A also, in this context, they really kind of filtered that commitment and that purpose and those goals down through the other levels of the system. So it was, the goals were set by the leadership, the municipality leadership, but they filtered that down to kind of the school leadership and the teacher level as well, in a way of building that kind of consensus and the collaborative approach to achieving the goal. And then from that establishment of purpose, what we argue is that from that came these effective improvements to technical practices. And so from that, they were able to implement, extensive support for teachers, new structured teaching and learning materials, classroom observation and coaching and things like that, but all aligned with the already established purpose that everyone was working towards together. They were also then able to implement improvements to support functions, again, in alignment with that purpose. So improvements to HR that led to meritocratic hiring of school principals, improvements to information systems by introducing a new learning-based monitoring system. So by having those clear goals and commitment in place, then they were able to make these changes that were in alignment with those goals. And then what we argue is that body of efforts and reforms work together to produce those large learning gains that we observe.
Michelle, 2 minutes.
Perfect. Okay, so I have another example, which I knew I wouldn't likely have time for, so that's fine. But just to say, and I think because we heard so much about Asia early on, to say that was a Brazil example, there was a Tanzania reform as well that has a similar story that can be told. So I do think there is evidence to suggest that this isn't maybe an Asia-specific phenomenon, but we do see this kind of theme coming out in other contexts as well. And with that, I just want to take the last 2 minutes to touch on some of what we see in terms of how we've seen this type of commitment fostered in different contexts. So if purpose is serving such an important role, how have we seen kind of national leaders, internal champions, NGOs, and international donors or stakeholders help to foster this kind of commitment to the purpose of learning in different contexts? So these are a few that we pull out in the paper. There are other ways, of course, but these are a few that stand out in the cases that we have. So one is conducting and funding learning assessments to spur this kind of political and citizen-led attention and pressure to act. So new information on learning outcomes, and especially in places where learning outcomes are low and revealed from assessment, are a common theme across examples in terms of driving that commitment to act. New information on learning certainly does not guarantee action by any means, but we argue it might be a necessary, even if it's not a sufficient condition for driving this kind of system-wide change. A second one is supporting domestic think and do tanks. And so these groups often have an outsized influence on what politicians prioritize and commit to. They have the strong in-country relationships. And they can also play a role of helping ensure that new information and assessments on learning do lead to that kind of action. And then the last one is funding programs and scholarships for tomorrow's leaders. So this is kind of playing the long game. So supporting future leaders today and future champions today by making those long-term investments. And just to say, these might not look like typical kind of education projects, but what we argue is that these are the types of efforts that might be needed to support education system transformation at that kind of higher level in support of learning outcomes. And just to close with a quote from one of our teams, that the systems that change are the ones that want to change, just as kind of driving at that. The drive and the commitment is seems like a precondition and certainly a common theme across places where we've seen education system transformation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank
Michelle.
you.
Great. So now I'm going to ask all the presenters to turn on the videos again, and we're going to go to the Q&A, which I think will be quite a vibrant session given the range and quality of questions that have come through. So we're going to do questions in batches. We have about 20 minutes, so I'm gonna hope for at least 2 batches of questions. So presenters try to pick one question and be selective. And the first batch of questions, we're going to do 3. So first is a question from Anand Kumar Ravichandran, saying that I agree that identifying a strong purpose is a key driver for progressing toward goals. However, I'm a little bit skeptical about how purpose is defined. And, because purpose can get diluted as it moves from central policymakers to the front line. So I would like to hear your comments about how Japan and Korea was able to align all stakeholders in the system toward the purpose, if that's the case. And I think beyond Japan and Korea, any of the other cases you've looked at, panelists, that'd be great. Then there's 2 questions I'm bundling together about how does the culture or political ideology of a context influence the purpose of education? So this was posed by Julia Miller in the context of countries that have been influenced by Confucianism and those that haven't, and by Steve Cleese in the context of countries that have been influenced by socialist histories like Vietnam and Cuba and those that haven't. So third question. So far we have aligning all stakeholders at different levels, the purpose, and then we have culture and social political context and purpose. And the third one, this is from Steve Cleese of the University of Maryland. So almost all the research by Rise and others looks at education interventions that impact only on cognitive achievement in reading and math. And since there are so many other very important purposes of education, so problem solving, creativity, curiosity, civic mindedness, self-discipline, self-efficacy, compassion, and so on, isn't it irrational and inefficient to base education policy on a partial measure of 2 outcomes when we want and need education to do so much more? I'm personally very interested in this question because I think it links to, for example, thin and thick measures like Dan was talking about. It links to baselines versus aspirations, which we've been having conversations with the RISE director about. It also links to global goals versus locally articulated ones. But anyway, so to rehash, we have aligning all levels of stakeholders to the purpose. Second question was culture and political ideology. And third question is 2 narrow measures versus wider purposes. Panelists, feel free to just unmute and go ahead. Luis, why don't you start? Yeah.
Sure, I could start. Whether the purpose gets diluted, I think part of the answer is that when what's being borrowed is more means than purpose, and the purpose is more national, it gets diluted less because it's endogenous. It comes from the nation itself. And I would also think that the higher the purpose, the less it gets diluted. If the purpose is to save the nation, as opposed to having a Gini coefficient of 0.43 instead of 0.55, or if the purpose is couched in terms of class struggle, namely reducing the power of the samurai, as opposed to some abstract equality goal, it's easier to keep focused on the purpose. The other is that to the extent that either means or purpose get widely debated and discussed within the society rather than just borrowed or not borrowed as a simple-minded thing, the more likely it is to not get diluted. So in Japan, all these issues of purpose and means got debated for 70 years. That's a pretty long time to internalize things. And lastly, also that the purpose is part of the school itself. So in Japan, part of the purpose of the school is transmitted through the school itself. It's not just something that stands above the school, but all those purposes are actually embedded in the teaching and learning in the school. Quickly on the other point about what we measure, I think countries like Japan and Korea measure some of these things because they're easy to measure, they're easy to change, and they're fairly important, even if they're not the most important. Clearly in Japan, it's moral education that's the most important. But the Japanese have figured out that schools that do a good job on the basics also tend to do a good job on moral education because they have imbued the purpose. So in a sense, they use these measurements as proxies, and they realize that they're proxies. But because you're imbued in purpose, a little bit to Dan's point, you're also going to tend to do a good job on the other stuff. Japan spends much more time on moral and civic education and moral and civic practices than they do on math and reading. But they measure math and reading because that's easy to measure. It is fairly important, if not the most important. And schools that are imbued with purpose tend to do both things well. I think that's my take on it.
Thanks, Luis. Jonathan, go ahead if you'd like.
Well, I'll just say, do you want me to comment on the first question or as I wish, or? Okay. I'm just sort of intrigued by this interesting question of the sort of developmentalist aspects of education policy, since this is, you know, a theme that comes up in other contexts about rapid industrialization, and you know, social policy does not lend itself to this sort of thinking about how you can have a national project, policy project, and pushing it through, because social policy is so, you know, intrinsically decentralized. And the organizational requirements for instituting this massive system-wide change involving thousands of bureaucratic actors across a very, you know, socially diverse landscape is just it's a tough thing to do. And, you know, I think even within the Southeast Asia context, if we look at Vietnam and Thailand, for example, these are countries that, you know, exhibit features that are a bit different, for example, than places like Korea, Japan, Taiwan. There's much greater decentralization, and the ability of states, whether communist or not, to achieve developmentalist objectives, I think has been shown to be somewhat less robust. And so I'm sort of struck in this instance, this sort of transitioning to this question about socialism that was raised in one of the questions. I'll get back to Confucianism in a second. Is that, you know, this question of the organizational requirements for driving and sustaining system-wide change is just high. And so I think, you know, in places like, you know, Vietnam and Cuba, for example, was mentioned, you do have this commitment to redistribution, to getting kids into school, to preventive health. You have levels of bureaucratic discipline and compliance and professionalism that are lacking in most other countries of comparable income. But on the other hand, there were some deficiencies. For example, in the Vietnam context, you know, the emphasis in the education system on rote memorization, and indeed still the elite focus within these socialist states of training, you know, elite bureaucrats. This wasn't necessarily producing the kind of education and learning outcomes that we're looking for. So in Vietnam in the last 20 years, there's been this major push to improve the system's performance, not simply with respect to learning through the accumulation of knowledge, but new kinds of skill sets. And in this context, I think there are a lot of, you know, challenges that extend across countries, particularly in the context of, you know, sort of the expansion of the world market, marketization of lower and middle income countries, where you have these
in a sentence or two.
Yeah, where you have these challenges of inequality creeping up. So, you know, in the Vietnam context, as well as they've done, it's nonetheless remains the case that, you know, kids from lower income households are facing a lot of difficulty keeping up. And so going back to Luis's, you know, presentation, you know, this aspect of inequality, how do you sustain this, you know, steadfast commitment to promoting equity at a system level in the context of these very strong sort of marketizing forces, I think is a challenge that is of interest across the countries that we've addressed, in all countries. Yeah.
Thanks, Jonathan. Dan, Michelle, whichever one of you wants to go.
Sure, I'll just say a couple quick things, which are, so we've been talking mainly in these questions, look at sort of purposes which are at national level. And so when we're talking about sustaining the purpose here, it means, can we get this sort of national level push to be, I don't know, ramified through the individual behaviors of bureaucrats at a much lower level? I think that's a really important set of questions about why people believe, why they keep the faith. I think actually public admin or the study of systems are not the places where we know the most about that, but rather kind of social movement theory. That said, I think in most countries, I think the situation we find ourselves in is not a Japan, Korea, Vietnam kind of circumstance, but much more a kind of, where I think Michelle was, and sort of where do we build from the reality we see. And so if we sort of allow multiple purposes to flourish, just so long as they're consistent with doing the thing we want done in that particular space, then we sort of don't have to worry about that problem in quite the same way. We have to monitor it, but we don't have to worry about it as a kind of, how do we get everyone to sign up to the party line? Because there doesn't need to be one. We can let more flowers bloom so long as they make, I don't know, the overall field pretty in Leiden, outside where Jonathan's living right now. So with tulips this time. So, and to the kind of thin versus thick metrics conversation, I think I just want to second the spirit of what I heard Louise say, which is that, if you don't put pressure on reading and math scores as the only things that your education system is trying to do, but use them as inputs, they're pretty good indicators. It's not that math and reading scores are a good proxy for overall system performance. It's that if you put pressure upon them as a kind of way to drive the system in a thin metric sort of way, it's if what we care about is helping kids do better, well, we're going to see that reading and math are some of the ways that kids are doing better. And now we don't have to worry about the metrics in quite the same way, because all of the accountability isn't flowing from the top down in the system, but rather through the kind of social and broader societal and cultural sort of things that I think everyone in this presentation was talking about, in this panel was talking about. Thanks.
Sure, thanks. Okay, yeah, great set of questions, and I know there's a rich discussion happening in the Q&A and chat as well. I'll pick up on a couple of them. So first on this, the point that Luis and Dan have already touched on it, so I'll just touch briefly, but on like literacy and numeracy and are we measuring the right things? I would say something similar in the sense of, we don't think of that as, I wouldn't say by any means those are the only things that matter. Of course, the goal is a full, well-rounded, holistic education for all children, but there is a place where, two pieces. One is the kind of proxy case where all education systems do have at some level a goal of achieving foundational skills for the children in their schooling system. And so as a proxy for, is the system achieving some of the things that it was set out to achieve, there is some proxying where you can say if they're not achieving some of these foundational things, they're probably struggling to achieve some of the others as well. And then also, I think the other piece too is the idea of these being foundational building blocks for a lot of the other things that we want for children in these education systems. And so, I do think it's difficult to fully empower children in, say, like creativity or in civics education if they don't have foundational reading. So I also think of it as, building blocks that are clearly meant to facilitate later learning, but they are critical building blocks because it's difficult to engage in some of that later learning if you don't have those, early pieces. So that's on that. And then I just wanted to touch briefly on the first question about this kind of how purpose is defined, but then also, how to align the different actors in the system. And I think this is, the idea of how do you know what the purpose is? Something might be stated but not acted upon, or it's stated and it is acted upon, and then how is it acted upon effectively to the different levels. So I actually think that's a really important piece, because I think it's a driver for how we can engage in some of these systems and figure out the right way forward. So is a purpose of, say, foundational learning for all just in name only, or is the leader who's made that statement really truly acting upon it, and looking at what the metrics would be for knowing where that commitment is and therefore what's needed is an important piece of it. And in terms of how it's been filtered through systems, I would point to that kind of some of those examples in the Sobral case that I just touched on very briefly. But, in that context, for example, they did a lot of socializing of these goals. They didn't just set it and say, go. Like they did a lot of socializing of the goals. They created a lot of new materials and support structures in alignment with those goals. I know one example is they set up, and I think this relates to Dan's work, some reward systems for teachers and like public celebrations, but that were on thick indicators. They weren't pay for performance type systems. It wasn't that if you increase this much standard deviation, you get this much in your pay. It was much more of a kind of, we're all in this together. Congratulations, you achieved something, and kind of public and very like, promoting it. And so I feel like is a lot of relation between that example and some of the stuff that Dan talks about, and that there's something there in terms of how you filter that and socialize those ideas and those goals to kind of, refocus the different people in the system.
Great. Thanks, Michelle. Okay, looking at time, we have time for about 1 minute more per person. So I'm just going to float 2 questions. So one is from Emily Markovich-Morris, and she says, at Brookings, our family, school, and community engagement team has been studying the beliefs on purpose of the school globally, as expressed by teachers, parents, and caregivers, and students, and how that plays into how these groups engage with school and how they see the quality of school. So the question is, how does more bottom-up approaches, so understanding families, teachers, and student beliefs, play into your conceptual frameworks? And then we have a question from Simon King saying, is it possible that we're looking at examples of positive deviance at the national level, and that these examples are interesting to learn from, but very, very hard to replicate? So just about a minute each per presenter. We can go in the same order. You can answer those 2 questions or just say your last words, and Michelle will end with you. So you'll have the last final say.
I don't want to go first because I want to prepare a bit more.
Okay, then Jonathan, you look ready to go. So why don't you have your minute?
Well, looks can be deceiving, but I will take a shot at this, which is that, in Vietnam, there is this effort for schools to move towards a more sort of enterprise model, particularly schools that are in a position to access sort of new approaches to education. So it can be quite exciting, but it is difficult within this fairly rigid bureaucratic system. And so I think, what we're looking for in the Vietnam context is greater efforts to really align some of the education programming at the local level, provinces and district level, with these new approaches in a way that can help schools more flexibly pursue improvements in school performance. So
Great, thanks, Jonathan. Dad, maybe? Luis looks like he's still for the...
Yeah, I would just say something about the, I'm sorry, give me the second question once more, the second of the 2.
Are we just looking at national level examples of positive deviance that are interesting but hard to replicate? So
yeah. So I think that's sort of the direction I meant to push with my doesn't have to be Vietnam and Korea, right? So if we could draft a high sense of national purpose towards education in any particular country, I think we should do that, right? If we had bureaucrats who think they're part of the cause, I think we should do that. But part of the problem is actually related to the first, what Emily, I think, points out in her wise question, which is that, it's easy for that to become unmoored from local communities and contexts, unless there's some sort of intermediating institutions. I think just because there is a purpose doesn't make it good, right? So Kutsal Yeşilkayıt, one of Jonathan's colleagues at Leiden, has a wonderful paper about the mission-drivenness of the German government during the Nazi era, right? So Nazi-era bureaucrats were given an extreme amount of autonomy. They had a sense of national purpose and solidarity. Forgive me, I know that's a way of throwing a grenade in a conversation. I don't mean it that way, but purpose isn't inherently good, is I guess what I'm trying to say. And I think kind of mooring the purpose of bureaucrats in a different kind of accountability relationship with citizens and parents, and the kind of way I hear you pushing, Emily, is to me, in some sense, an answer to both questions. And in the spirit of like Plato's philosopher king, isn't as good as a purpose pointed in the right direction, but is far better than a national level purpose maybe not pointed in whatever we define the right direction to be. And so I see that as a much more tractable way forward in more systems. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. Luis, all yours, and try to stick to a minute.
Yeah, sure. Okay. I mean, the bottom-up question, yes, definitely there. Not so much from parents, I would say, but in both countries from the teachers. The teacher unions have engaged the government ideologically, much more so than in most countries. Most countries, teacher unions worry about bread and butter issues. In Japan, they're very ideological, very progressive, and they have forced the Japanese government over time to acquire a more humanistic purpose. So, and that goes right to Dan's point that what we're trying to say here is that it's important to have a purpose. Now, the purpose could be really nasty, militaristic, imperialistic, as it was in Japan, roughly 1885 or 90 through to the war, or it can be humanistic. But the point is the purpose, having a purpose. And in the case of Japan, more recently in the last 50 years, to some degree has come up from the teachers' unions, forcing the government to accept a more humanistic view. Now, the issue of whether these are outliers and when is reasoning, yes, we devote quite a bit of emphasis in the paper on context and what might be applicable and what might not. Now, what probably transfers fairly well is the importance of purpose, not the means that we're used to deliver on that purpose. That's harder to copy, and I kind of ran out of time in trying to sort that out.
Yeah, it has been too rich a discussion to be constrained to this format, but Michelle, last word to you.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, I think this point about the question on parents and kind of the community level, I'll touch on that too, because I think because it's so critical, right? And kind of parents and teachers and that component of it play such a critical role. What we see in our research too is just the importance of recognizing that parents are constrained by the same system they're operating in too. So parents want what's best for their children, and in a lot of these contexts, including a lot of systems in Africa, for example, there's a primary leaving exam that opens the door to secondary school. So what do parents most want? They want their children to be able to go on. And so they focus on these types of things. So in terms of, we need to include them in those, and we need to think about kind of the system constraints that are kind of maybe hindering some of the other goals that parents would have for their children too. They feel like they have to be so focused on certain areas because it will, constrain their children in other areas. So thinking of them as actors within the system, and this is why we think like kind of the system, not like national system, but system as in like an approach that takes into account all the different levels of the system is important in thinking about what could bring about kind of transformation. With that, I think I was on deck to make a closing remark, and I know we're at time. So I'm just going to say it's been such a rich discussion, and I know I've really enjoyed it. I really like this combination of presentations because I think it is really tapping into this, being able to look across countries, across the time periods like Luis was pulling at, across the levels of the system, and identify the role that purpose is playing in all of those different components. So I've appreciated the richness of that and the ability to look at it from all of these different angles. From the various presentations here. So thanks to everyone, but Yue, I'll hand it back over to you for the more formal kind of thanks and closing.
Yeah, just to echo Michelle's thanks, and also apologize for all the questions we couldn't get to. Now we will be saving the chat and compiling with the Q&A, and we'll share that with the presenters who might reach out back to you to engage. And 3 follow-up points for the audience. So one is you will also be getting a follow-up email from us that will have the slides of any presenters who are willing to share their slides, as well as links to papers that are out. So second point, and could we have the slide up, please? If you want to get involved in the messaging campaign, again, this is part of week 1, you can visit our campaign page. I believe someone will be putting the link in the chat, or follow us on social media at Rise Program or # From Schooling to Learning. Point number 3 is that as part of this campaign, we will be having a couple more webinars like this one. So one will be on November 15th on teaching and teachers in education systems. And then on the 6th of December, we'll have a joint webinar with the UNESCO GEM report about a new online tool for learning trajectories. And alongside all of these, we were talking global and national, what's specific. There are in-country, in-person activities happening across our community of practice. And you can see more information on that again on our campaign page. So With thanks to the speakers for such exciting presentations, with thanks to the audience for engaging so rigorously and honestly. I have just enjoyed this immensely. So thanks again, and we hope to see you soon in another RISE webinar.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Okay, thanks, Yue-Yi.
Thank you, Jonathan. And
Yeah,
thanks.
nice to see you.
Yeah.
We're the only ones left, maybe. Okay.